We know that prejudice has really bad consequences for LGBT people, and that the general mainstream church is highly prejudiced against gay persons. So what then is the psychological consequence of this toxic religion for LGBT persons compared to those who don't have this type of religious influence? Before I go any further, please let me acknowledge that in no way am I attempting to suggest that all LGBT persons are psychologically troubled, or that all Christians and churches are prejudiced towards LGBT persons. I'm only speaking in broad general terms here. Regarding the study that I was able to do recently, I was able to sample about 850 LGBT persons around Australia and used about 580 of these to begin exploring these themes. Participants answered questions through an online survey about their past and current religious and family experiences, their sense of self, their distress over their sexuality, and their internalised women negativity, for example. Next slide. Just to clarify, our measures of distress for this first study included a rating scale of how distressed participants felt when they considered their sexuality and their religious beliefs, and their internalised homonegativity, which in other words is basically just measuring self-hate or self-negativity because of one's sexuality. Now, a whole bunch of statistical analyses were carried out. I'm going to really dumb it down just to make it relative and kind of more bite-sized. But basically, for the overall analysis, participants were divided into three groups: those who have never been religious whatsoever, those who were but are no longer Christian, and those who were and remain Christian. And interestingly, the results confirm that it was Christians, those who were and who remained as such, who had the highest levels of distress, both in terms of a religion-sexuality conflict and internalised homonegativity. And this is a very important finding, as research to date has not explicitly documented this comparison between Christians and non-religious LGBT persons. Therefore, it appears that just the mere identification as a Christian was a risk factor for higher levels of psychological distress. When I presented this research in the UK recently, I used the title "To Hell or To Hell With It, The Rise or Not of a Religion-Sexuality Conflict." And I chose this title because it reflected the nature of responses from participants who took part in the study. And their responses were kind of around either their experience of religiosity or their lack thereof in relation to their sexuality. In the first instance, participants gave responses such as "sex over religion any day," or "I am who I am, if they don't like it, get over it." So very much kind of to hell with it sort of response. Compare that with many participants who felt quite differently. "I'm scared, really, really scared. So scared that my family and I will be ostracised from our religious and local community. I know that the church hates and rejects gays. I know that being truly out means leaving my church community, being rejected for communion, not being able to work in Catholic schools. They are all things that scare me and immobilise me with fear. I hate feeling like I have to make a choice. I hate that church authorities seem to push us out and force us to choose between the closet and breaking communion. I love my faith, but I don't know how much intolerance and rejection I can tolerate. Sometimes I just wonder if I'm going to hell." For these participants, the intersection of sexuality and religion has been highly distressing and has filled them with fear, shame, and painful experiences. Digging a bit deeper for the overall sample, additional factors seem to be important in predicting an outcome of distress. What we found is that the less out or open people were about their sexuality to the world, the more likely they were to be experiencing higher levels of distress. And this is fairly intuitive, since you'd expect that people who are more comfortable with their sexuality are perhaps less frightened about people discovering their orientation, maybe less concerned about other people's evaluations of them, and probably more accepting of themselves. They aren't expending great amounts of energy trying to cover their tracks all the time, basically. We also found that a person's sense of self was really important when looking at some of the distress outcomes as well. In a nutshell, participants who had a poorer sense of self or a weaker sense of who they were as a person were more likely to be experiencing higher levels of distress over their sexuality. And again, this makes a lot of sense. If you think about it, if a person has a strong and stable sense of who they are, what they're all about, and they're kind of more internally grounded, then this is a very powerful thing. Such people would be far less likely to look to other people or other doctrines to tell them what to do, what to follow, or who they are. They're less likely to be sucked into any negative messages from the church about their sexuality because they're more likely to follow what they know to be true inside themselves, and less likely to allow others to make those important decisions for them. Contrast that with a person who has a poor sense of self or kind of a weak understanding of who they are as an individual and what they're all about. Because a person like this is less likely to be grounded within themselves, less able to make up their own minds about important things regarding their lives, and more likely to look at external people and external doctrines to influence the values, beliefs and truths that they will live by. For these people, toxic influences, whether it's religion, family, friends, whatever, are more likely to take hold. It was interesting to find that the extent to which a person was connected with the gay community, the LGBT community in general, seemed to be important. We found that individuals who felt they had a low sense of connection with the gay community, or in other words, had less to do with other groups of people who were similar to them, were more likely to be experiencing high levels of distress as well. Now, this could be due to a number of reasons. Perhaps this effect can be explained by the fact that having less connection with the gay community leaves one more isolated, lonely, or cut off from people who share their same sexuality. In that sense, it might simply be due to having lower levels of social support, which seems plausible. But it could also reflect that individuals felt they had very little in common with others of the gay community apart from their sexual status, and hence were not able to find social support that was appropriate for them. Or perhaps these individuals simply had less connection with the gay community full stop because they were not yet at a healthy place in accepting themselves, and as such they could not healthily interact with others who were like them. But either way, having less connection with similar others in the LGBT community seems to be a potential risk factor for distress. So what happened next? Basically, our results had shown that yes, those who were Christians in the sample were more likely to be experiencing higher levels of distress over their sexuality than those who were non-religious. But now we need to know what specifically was it about being a Christian that made a person more likely to be distressed. In other words, what particular religious or personal factors were actually linked with, or perhaps contributing to that kind of demise in mental health and that increase in stress. So for these particular analyses, we looked just at those who were currently Christian in the sample. What we found was very insightful because what it seemed to boil down to was the beliefs of the individual and the beliefs of other people who were significant to those individuals. We've thrown in a whole heap of religious measures and scales to try and tease this out further, and what seemed to keep coming up reasonably strongly was a religious factor called introjection. Introjection is a particular type of religious internalisation, which is basically just a certain way which we kind of take on some sort of external doctrine or religious belief and make it our own. And we've already talked about a variety of reasons for which we come to have faith in a certain set of beliefs. And these can range from healthy reasons to more sinister causes. Introjection itself is not a particularly healthy type of religious internalisation, and yet is probably fairly common in the churches. In introjected internalisation, behaviours are performed because one should do them, or because not doing so might give rise to anxiety, guilt, or a loss of esteem within an individual. We might come to internalise beliefs as a way of avoiding guilt and shame, or out of fear of losing the approval of oneself or of others. In this sense, introjected internalisation is not really a very volitional, self-determined kind of process. It doesn't reflect beliefs or standards that are personally chosen and valued. Rather, this internalisation comes about as a result of internal pressures and conflicts and not from a strong and stable sense of self. Introjected religious beliefs and regulations are not thought to be associated with particularly good mental health outcomes, and that's certainly what we found in this study. So the more that a Christian LGBT person had this type of internalisation, the more distress that they also experienced over their sexuality.